So Lillian has been unavoidably detained, so we're going to proceed with our first panel of the day, our keynote panel. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before I introduce Akash Kapoor, our moderator for the panel. This session right now is being live streamed and is public, but after that, through the rest of the day and into tomorrow, we're going to be operating under the Chatham House rule. So anything discussed is to stay here, not for attribution. Also, restrooms are in the back if you need them at any point. Please feel free to go step out. So our first panel today is called On Sovereign AI. And we have an excellent lineup to talk through and unpack what is a very muddled and fuzzy concept that means different things to different actors and to different countries and to different stakeholders around the world right now. These three on the stage have done some of the most important thinking and writing about what sovereign AI means, what AI nationalism means. So we're very lucky to have them. We're going to be moderated by Akash Kapoor, who is a senior fellow here at Planetary Politics. And I'm going to hand it over to him, and he will introduce our two panelists and begin the panel. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, is that working? Is that good? Is it working? Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's good to see this room. It's been a big build-up, long build-up to this. So thank you all for being here. And I'm so excited to be up on stage with Pablo and Susan, whose work I've been reading for a while, and whose work I've used in my own work, and it's helped me think about this stuff. And yesterday, when I posted this on LinkedIn, when I posted this event, I got a message from somebody being like, "Wow, looks like a great event," and I know them, and they're both, quote, box office. So, welcome to the movies, guys. Wow. And the show's going to run for about an hour and a quarter. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then I'm going to ask them to very briefly kind of stake out their positions or their understanding of what AI sovereignty means. And then we're going to do a moderated conversation followed by Q&A. And please do post your questions even as the conversation's going on, because I might read those and kind of interject them into our conversation as we're going along. So Susan, nice to meet you. Susan is a research professor and George Washington University Public Interest Technology Scholar. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and she directs the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub at GW. Her current research is focused on AI governance, a notion of AI overcapacity, which I think is very interesting and I hope we'll get to today, as well as issues concerning the free flow of data or the unfree flow of data and how that might affect AI and trust in data. Pablo, technology policy expert focused on AI and cloud computing. He's on the board of the Open Technology Fund, an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, an advisor to various companies and nonprofits. He used to lead Google Cloud's global public policy team, and before that he was at Microsoft and LinkedIn, so he brings a diverse perspective to the table. He's also on the advisory committee of Princeton's CITP, Center for Information Technology Policy. And his work focuses a lot on AI sovereignty. In fact, he has a new paper out that I've been reading called Sovereign AI in a Hybrid World, National Strategies and Policy Responses, which it's a great combination of actually telling what different countries are doing on the sovereign AI and analysis. So, one of the problems in this field is we get conceptual frameworks and then we get actual on-the-ground kind of empirical work, and I think that paper is like a great combination. All right, so let's jump in, and I'm going to ask each of you, maybe Susan first, just briefly tell us what you think of what you mean by sovereign AI. Let's keep it brief. Maybe briefly stake out a position, or at least a hint on whether this is like a desirable thing or not a desirable thing.
Okay, hi everybody, nice to see you all. So basically, I'm troubled by the term sovereign AI because I don't think by definition AI or data can be sovereign. Why do I think that? Because I believe data can be many things simultaneously, but it is often a global public good. We know it's best when it's shared. I'm looking at these issues. One thing that he did not say is that I'm co-PI of the NSF NIST Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society. And what that is one of the 8 trustworthy AI institutes funded by NSF plus NIST. We've been working on this. I've been working on AI since 2016 because of the hub. And so, you know, I try to look at it from a utilitarian perspective and just thinking that AI is something that most nations need to have, but they need to be sovereign over it, which means, do you control it, and does it control the destiny of your nation?
Thanks.
Great. So first of all, thank you, Akash, for the invitation. Thank you to New America for organizing this event. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. And Susan, we meet. It's great to see you. So Anne-Marie's opening kind of scrambled my thoughts a little bit. So let me riff on what she said a little bit. In 2018, Kai-Fu Lee, who's this technologist, investor, entrepreneur, who currently runs an AI company in Shanghai, predicted that one of the potential outcomes of the AI world was that essentially that we would move into this kind of bipolar world with the United States on one side and China on the other. And then the question came up, well, then what happens to the rest of the world? What happens to other countries? In this version of Kai-Fu Lee's vision, those countries break out into those two camps and essentially become vassal states of each of the US and China. And the relationship is essentially that, for example, China provides its countries with subsidies for social safety nets and so forth, and other investments and support mechanisms. And in exchange, those countries provide data so that China, at the either government or private sector, can continue to train their models. As I recall, the economists called this kind of neo-colonialist system of AI vassal states. And candidly, it's a very dystopian vision of the world. Again, kind of going back to this idea, open versus closed, dystopian, versus kind of optimistic and lollipops and butterflies. And it really stuck with me. At the time, I was responsible for Google Cloud's global public policy team. It really sat with me as potentially a future to watch and perhaps avoid. Fast forward 6 years, and what I think that we're actually seeing on the ground is a push by many countries around the world against this kind of dyadic competition between the US and China in AI, and an emerging movement that some have called sovereign AI. And essentially what that is, there are many kind of definitions that are kind of floating, attempted definitions that are floating out there, but essentially it's kind of putting into the hands of domestic actors, whether it's government or private sector players, the development, deployment, and control of kind of the AI inputs of production, so models, data, infrastructure, and so forth. And the reason why governments and countries are doing this fundamentally is about kind of independence and control. And we're seeing kind of a number of examples of this. I've been recently focused on AI model building and infrastructure development. And so, for example, you see Taiwan. Taiwan has an AI system called TIDA. It's a Taiwan AI. I always mess this up. Dialogue engine, and basically they've spent $7.5 million on essentially kind of putting together a mechanism to protect their information space and also their democracy. On the infrastructure side, for example, you see France retrofitting its Zhanzé supercomputer to the tune of something like $44 million and like million in that case. And essentially kind of setting up an infrastructure so that France can assist with startups and research institutions, et cetera, allowing them to kind of build and develop their models in a domestic setting. Now, the question finally about whether this is a good trend or a bad trend, I mean, if you look at it through a normative lens, honestly, I think that it depends on the situation, Akash, and also it is early days. So, for example, in the Taiwanese case, that's probably a good thing. there are cases that you've pointed out, for example, where a government might use AI to censor or otherwise control their population. So I think that again, it's early days, and we're seeing numerous cases. So we need to kind of keep watching that. And so essentially, we're watching and seeing how this all plays out.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of origins of this concept, because you situated it in 2000. I mean, you kind of started here in 2018 with Kai-Fu Lee's book, but of course it goes further back. I wonder, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to ask questions, and either one or both of you. I don't think you need to both feel like you need to weigh in on every question, so I'm going to pose this to him, and if you want to weigh in on that. But I'd like to go a little further back and think about the origins of this, and particularly its relationship to this concept of digital sovereignty or cyber sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, so the two are definitely related. I mean, candidly, I think that digital sovereignty. First, if you look at the true origins, I mean, I think that there's a little bit of debate about this, but I think that digital sovereignty, the concept started in kind of the Chinese academic community and Chinese government community, where it started as kind of cyber sovereignty, internet sovereignty, kind of ramped up roughly 2010. When Google moved its search engine from mainland China to Hong Kong, Hillary Clinton gave her 5 Freedoms speech, and the Chinese government kind of came in with their own vision of kind of how this should all play out. But and then that migrated to Europe, where the French government, French academics in particular, were kind of really kind of bolstered the idea of digital sovereignty. But I think that the truth of the matter is that in many ways it's kind of more of a rallying call to essentially kind of assert more control over technology. And it makes sense, just given how important digital technology is to governance, to economic development, and so forth. The challenge is to find kind of specific examples of digital sovereignty and to really kind of like look at cases of where that's actually happening. In my experience, you see it, for example, in cloud computing, where again, the French government has required a number of conditions of foreign cloud providers that want to provide services to government and to key industries, so ownership requirements and so forth. So I think cloud is one case. And AI sovereignty, I think, is a subset or an offshoot of digital sovereignty, is another very concrete case, in particular because my focus has been on not government, in this case, acting as regulator, but government acting as market participant, and really kind of having a strong hand, again, in developing models, building infrastructure, and so forth. So I think that's the overall picture and the connection between digital sovereignty and AI sovereignty.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the origins, you mentioned the academic community in China, where they were using the term, it's been translated as cyber sovereignty. I think the irony of that is the first instance I found of cyber sovereignty was in the 90s, when digital activists were talking about cyber sovereignty as the independence of cyberspace from government. So, the term gets sort of flipped on its head by the Chinese in the early 2000s.
Well, it's actually earlier than that I found, and here's how I see it. So I've been writing a paper on the history of the free flow of data, so data as in its multi-dimensions. And so in the 1970s, when the United States and Japan were dominant in software, you see in trade discussions this notion of information sovereignty, discussion at the WTO about who controls the data that goes into software. And France and Canada in particular say they have to have cultural sovereignty because a lot of those ideas are expressions of culture that is sort of use software to send it and to make it data flows, essentially. These revolutions in telecommunications as well as software. So that's where I see it starting. And nations saying, this is our data, we need more control over it. But I totally agree with Pablo. And I want to say one other thing, though. I think where the two of us are starting from is quite different, and you are too. Like, to me, any form of data-driven sector is a public good where the services are provided by the private sector. And I see so many ironies here. for example, the United States, and I would say France, are becoming more like China in this attempt to control where information flows and who controls the technologies built on data. And I find that trend very worrisome. There was this book about how, it was about the space race. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's called, I think, From the Heavens to the Earth. And it reminds me so much of that situation. Instead of Russia, though, it was called USSR then. But so that's one irony. The other irony I see, which is something that Pablo pointed out to me, and is this notion of AI sovereignty from a corporate perspective. And he showed me NVIDIA's program, Microsoft's program, and then I started looking further. So you have American firms out there saying to nations, not only do you need to have sovereignty over your cloud, so it's a local cloud, which these same companies, well, not all of the same companies, but many of the cloud companies said, no, your cloud service provider doesn't have to be local in order for your data to be protected. But now, many of those companies, and some different companies, NVIDIA would be the best example, are making the argument that, no, you need to have control over your AI, and they're using that to make money. And I find that extremely troubling because it makes it hard for the United States, building on another idea that Pablo came up with, which is the idea of digital sovereignty. How are we credible?
Solidarity.
Solidarity. Yeah. Thank you for correcting me.
They kind of sound the same, which is a problem.
I'm just learning English, so bear with me. But it just seems to me illogical. If the United States companies are saying, you have to have control over this, the United States government is saying, let's all cooperate to build a Western AI, and yet that is not what is really happening. And they see the United States taking ever more control, like yesterday's report from the US-China Security and Economic Commission, right? I think that's what it's called. And they're saying, the United States has to put tons of money into AGI so China can't get there first. Whatever you think of that idea, in a time when lots of people are concerned about inflation and lots of other people are concerned about cutting government budgets for science, it's troubling. We don't have a consistency to our positions, I think. And then there's this other model, which is, I'd call it the Saudi UAE model, where, they're going to buy their way into AI dominance, and they have multi, approaches, whether it's investing in Facebook or any other AI company, or building their own by, a supply chain analysis, by investing in education, buying the best, computer scientists and data scientists, et cetera, building the infrastructure out. So I think it's very worrisome where we're at.
So that's, we talked about the history, but I guess I'd like to sort of talk about the web of motivations, and that's sort of what you're getting at here, these sort of different confluence of interests coming together. And it's not just like a fuzzy term, as Gordon said at the beginning, it's also, there's like a fuzzy sort of set of actors and different actors driving in different ways. And I wonder if either of you wants to talk about that, and that may lead us in the direction of like normative, whether this is a normatively desirable thing, but who's pushing this stuff? And what's the sort of confluence of interest here, either one of you?
Well, I mean, again, I am looking at this from the implications of the technology as a global public good. It can be, the problem is that many nations, I've only counted 8 explicitly, say that this is not only a general purpose technology, it's a critical technology. If you don't know what that means, it means that it's not only essential to economic progress, but is essential to national security. So given that that is so, they say they have to invest in it. But to me, that means, okay, so if you look at the supply chain, what exactly do you do? And if you're Australia, let's say, which is one of those nations that says both, Australia cannot spend the a country of what, 18 million, 20 million? They can't spend what the UAE can spend through its sovereign wealth fund, or even Norway can spend with its sovereign wealth fund. So the kind of money that we're talking about, the energy costs, et cetera, is beyond the capabilities of many countries first. Secondly, again, if it's a global public good, we need to think about ways that we can work together to build AI. If, like, that report that came out of the China, the U.S.-China Security Economic Commission yesterday, it didn't say we need to work with our Western allies and cooperate and to make sure that the West has AGI. It said the United States must do that. And I understand these people work for the US government, but I find this very worrisome. The other part is I sit on a study group that the State Department funds for the former Soviet Union countries, and it is on data and science. And the minute the United States government came out with, and this has been since 2019, executive orders on the ICT supply chain, but when they came out with the provisions related to data broker sales to our adversary countries, they heard that as, and there are very good exceptions for science. I'm not saying it's undermining science, but the people on that committee said the United States looks totally hypocritical. And that's why I'm writing my paper, because the United States was the leading demandeur of the free flow of data since the 1970s, even though it wasn't explicit in a trade agreement.
So do you want to talk? Yeah,
I mean, just on your question about kind of like where does this all come from? It's a very messy picture. But let me kind of try to give this a shot. So, one of the impacts of, kind of the kind of time period around 2020 was that, a number of countries basically realized that there were these kind of two relatively new dynamics, right? The first was U.S.-China competition. The second was the kind of newly found dependence on kind of foreign goods, foreign services, and so forth. And I think that the confluence of that kind
You mean
of
like supply stuff?
Yeah, supply chain stuff, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that kind of like 1-2 punch of, oh my gosh, we are caught in this battle between the U.S. and China, and oh my gosh, we could get cut off at any given point, from foreign data flows, from foreign technology, and so forth. That, I think, really kind of activated a number of countries to start thinking about, this notion, and really kind of becoming a little bit more serious about this notion of digital sovereignty. And so, going back to the French example that I was giving, the French government basically put together this program of cloud de confiance. It got its national security, its digital security agency to put together a bunch of requirements for cloud providers that, among other things, required majority ownership of cloud infrastructure by European entities, as well as headquarters located in Europe. And so what you started to see then was American companies in particular starting to kind of move towards sovereignty and trying to kind of accommodate the requirements of sovereignty, and in some ways kind of skating towards the puck, right? Or skating ahead of the puck, like trying to get a little bit ahead of that. I think that what we're seeing right now on the commercial side is, some sense from the NVIDIAs and others of the world that this is where the world is going, and so they're either going to kind of, be part of it, or they're going to be in some way, shape, or form excluded from it. And so I think that it is this combination of kind of like national government interests and commercial interests that are kind of coming together to push this trend forward.
So I guess my response to that is that I feel that I see all those motivations, but that feels like the good side of the story, right? So all the sort of motivations you've outlined there are pretty honorable and pretty sort of like respectable. It's, you mentioned freedom and independence, and it's like sort of market forces responding to that desire. What about some of the less positive motivations here, or do you not see those?
Are you referring to Vladimir Putin's recent?
Perhaps. I'm going to let you name it. I'm going to let you
that Russia should build its own sovereign AI.
I'm just going to let you name the. I mean, you referred to it as a messy picture, so it's like, what else is happening?
I think that the other thing that is happening. I mean, again, whether it's bad or good, it's just reality. To your point about kind of the U.S. position on these issues, the truth of the matter, and everybody in this room knows that the U.S. has been essentially pursuing a number of sovereignty initiatives in the digital world that are meant to be targeted at China specifically, right? And, this is the high fence, small yard effort, and so restrictions on the sale of advanced chips to Chinese entities. Restrictions and reporting requirements on the training of large language models on American infrastructure, a new program that would essentially kind of clear a foreign government or foreign entity that wants to use American AI infrastructure. And so, a lot of this is, essentially kind of, government saying, well, hold on a second, to Susan's point, this used to be a fairly global, international, interconnected, set of resources and technologies. That's no longer happening. So we need to kind of, respond to that. On a more, to the earlier point about censorship and so forth, we are definitely also seeing kind of trends where, maybe it would be good for government to have control of some infrastructure in order to kind of distribute it more equitably to startups, nonprofits, research institutions, and so forth. But we're also seeing, for sure, regulatory efforts that are constraining speech and constraining expression through AI. The kind of canonical example, I guess, right now is essentially the Chinese government's requirement that AI needs to be tested to see if it complies with socialist values. That kind of trend and that kind of desire to control is, from my perspective, almost certainly not a good thing. Certainly not a good precedent for other countries. One last thing on this. So Singapore has a model that is basically trained on the Southeast Asian languages, roughly 11 languages, and it's called Sea Lion. If you look through kind of the press releases, articles, and so forth about Sea Lion, it's all great. It's essentially kind of like Singapore working with other Southeast Asian countries to develop their own kind of regional AI model. Having said that, there are definitely comments about how, for example, Sea Lion might be more culturally attuned to less democratic countries in Southeast Asia, and might, for example, whereas perhaps a U.S. trained model would be less sympathetic to those countries and those governments, a Southeast Asian model might give more of the benefit of the doubt. So we're definitely seeing kind of those trends, and yeah, again, I don't think that we can say all good, all bad. We are somewhere in this kind of middle scrum, trying to figure out how all these are going to go.
May I add something to that? I see three things that are deeply troubling here. Thing number one, so the argument essentially is not only Iran, Venezuela, China, Russia are adversaries, but they have this thing in common, authoritarian. Yet, it's okay, though, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are, maybe a different degree of authoritarianism, but nonetheless authoritarianism. Is there a justification for this? There's a lot of money in those countries and a lot of investment in U.S. tech. Hypocrisy. Go ahead.
But just on
and a male connection.
That's right.
What?
And a male connection.
Yeah, no, seriously.
Yeah.
The businessmen of the United States are deeply engaged, at least in Saudi Arabia.
For sure. Just really quickly, Susan, on that first point, it could be hypocrisy, it could be something else. I tend to think of, in particular, kind of what's happening with the UAE and specifically the Microsoft G42 deal, which is essentially, Microsoft putting in a significant, I think it's $1.5 billion investment into G42, a UAE AI company. There's conditionality attached to that, right? That essentially G42 will sever its relationships with Chinese companies, Huawei and others, and that the two companies in this partnership will operate, in kind of essentially a security agreement that has been according to public reports, looked at and reviewed by the Biden administration as well as by the UAE government. And so I agree with you that that is a case of concern, but I also tend to think that, for better or for worse, these AI relationships in the geopolitical context, need to be looked at from, kind of different perspectives. I think in this case, it is really the U.S. government trying to separate the UAE from the China tech stack.
Absolutely.
Right, and whether that is whether compromising on human rights or other matters is worth the price, I think stands to be seen.
See, I see it differently.
Oh,
I actually think it's a good move in
Yep.
some ways
Yep.
because I'm one of the few people that believe PNTR was a good thing,
Yep.
and that I think it takes a long time to move a nation from authoritarianism,
Yep.
especially through trade. But and it didn't happen. But I still wouldn't bet against that approach that you want to use economic relations to try to move a nation in the right direction. And if you had to pick a nation to do so, the UAE would be a good one, and the Saudis might be another good one. That said, it's troubling. The hypocrisy remains unaddressed, okay? It needs to be explicit so that, in this study group, I can explain to, let's say, a Kazakh scientist, maybe this is not so hypocritical. Thing two, there is no U.S., while USAID does a lot to try to help governments with AI, and we see MasterCard doing all sorts of nice things with data, and there isn't, I think, any attempt to really internationalize AI. There is an attempt to internationalize risk issues through the AI safety. But to me, I wrote a paper that got no attention whatsoever for CG. That's a Canadian think tank that I write for. And it was called the Global Wicked Problems Agency. And the idea was, let's create a cloud international agency which would rent data but be in the cloud, and it would rent data so it would yield more accurate, complete, and representative data sets. It would pay governments to try to survey their people, do a better job, share information on anonymization, personal data protection, et cetera, to disseminate these norms, the way the WTO was supposed to disseminate norms of good governance related to trade, that kind of thing. But we're not doing anything like that. And then let me just make the point about, in general, we're talking about foundation models here. We're not talking about the many variants of AI. And there are just so many, it's hard to generalize. But one thing is really clear, and that is currently, our data sets are inaccurate, incomplete, and not representative, right? They're often biased. We see fewer hallucinations, but we don't have great AI yet. And I don't understand why we don't focus more on, let's make that a goal and let's help everybody get better AI, given the many benefits that we see from AI to help mitigate wicked problems, to help science progress, to help individuals learn in communities where schools are terrible, et cetera. I don't see that effort, and I certainly don't expect it in the Trump administration. But if there were incentives, everybody would benefit if we shared. And, I don't know how that got lost, honestly, because, again, I'll be boring and redundant. To me, technology is a global public good. And, obviously there are different norms related to this, but I don't understand why there isn't more cooperation.
So that's a good segue to where I wanted to go, which was to kind of leave the geopolitics and the norms aside for a moment and talk about technology and perhaps innovation and what this means, what AI sovereignty means for that. I'm old enough to still remember in the dream of a global, seamless, interconnected internet, right? For me, my sort of natural reaction to sovereignty is breakdown of that dream, kind of. And so when you talk about internationalizing AI, or you talk about, I think, some version of collaborative AI here, I'm just curious what all this means for the technology and for the sort of advancement of AI, I've sort of cast it in negative terms. There's another way to look at it, I guess, which would be a kind of flowering of innovation and flowering of different models, because every country develops its own capacity. But I'm just curious how you both sort of see the future of technology in a world of sovereign AI.
Well, I guess, do you want?
I want you to go first.
If, maybe kind of setting aside a little bit the, kind of prediction game, which I am terrible at, and looking at kind of, current trends, I think I would kind of observe two things, Akash. The first is that even though we are talking about sovereign AI, when you kind of scratch the surface of kind of various models that are being developed by, with the support of, countries around the world, when you look at the infrastructure that is supporting the training of these models, the truth of the matter is that all that infrastructure and all that technology remains global and remains pretty open. I mean, the irony in some ways, or kind of like the jujitsu move of sovereign AI models, is that if you look kind of through again, Singapore, Spain, Italy, just any number of countries that are kind of developing their own sovereign models, they are often built on open source. So basically they're fine tuning of Llama 2 or Llama 3, which is kind of globally available. And furthermore, what these countries are doing is they're actually releasing their models in essentially kind of open source. And so I think that even though there is this name sovereign, the reality, it's almost like the German sovereign fund that supports open source software. It's kind of sovereignty through essentially proliferating with technology and leveling the playing field. And so I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. I think the second thing too is just briefly is that we talk about kind of the fragmentation of the digital world, and I agree with that. But I think that that at least from an intent perspective, and at least from I think the U.S. government side, it is a desire to have something close to a global digital ecosystem with significant concerns about Chinese activity, right? And so I think that and whether you agree with that or not, whether you think that it should all be kind of like unified, I do think that ultimately there is this desire to essentially kind of like have a coalition of open, rule-bound, democratic, hopefully societies that are cooperating. But there is this kind of pressure on the side to figure out, okay, well, what happens with with China, which is, I mean, quite the contrary to that overall system. I mean, do you bring them in, and do we then kind of go through the WTO process? I mean, because I think that's the concern, or do you kind of keep them out and try to build a a robust system that is exclusive of a country of concern like China? So again, I mean, to me, there's this highlight of sovereignty, but underneath there is a lot of kind of cooperation, reliance on different technology, openness, and so forth. And so it ends up being a little bit more nuanced.
So what I'm hearing there is sovereignty is the kind of the second scenario I outlined, which is sovereignty as a form of national empowerment rather than sort of national closed borders. And the sort of scenario where you're empowering potentially various models and various iterations and a kind of like laboratory, in an idea it's like a laboratory of AI because you're getting all these more contextually sensitive things coming out. Anyway, so.
I mean, I agree and I disagree. And here's where I agree. The competition is international. AI is international by definition. If we look at the supply chain, we see more and more nations restricting access to it. And that's my work on AI overcapacity.
Are we talking data in particular here?
No, we're talking every aspect of the supply chain. Capital, expertise, data, and compute. And so, not every nation is doing these restrictions, but can I just take a step back? And what Pablo said which is regarding the international competition. It's true, there are certain basic models. Again, we're talking foundation models, generative AI. We're not talking all types of AI. And there are many leaderboards. Have you seen these? It's beauty contests. And if you just plug in LLM leaderboards, you'll see there is this sharing of who's best, who's fastest, based on what I'd call very clear normative tests, which are, how fast is it and how accurate is it and blah, blah, blah. And some of them are even go to trust and social responsibility. Okay, so Pablo's entirely right in that regard. I don't want to discard that. And, research, I think this is just so important. Like, there are certain conferences, neuro-IPS, that are global. I think there is an effort to really be international. And you'll see that at the AI Summit in Paris. And even at the meeting, which I think is today, the AI Summit in San Francisco that NIST is organizing, Rob Reich. Okay, so there is that trend. But there is this other trend that's going along with it, which is, I see it as very dangerous. So to me, there is a beggar thy neighbor policy going on. And what I mean by that is, beggar thy neighbor could be towards one country. We could call it China or Russia. Mm-hmm. But when you deny access to the goods or services that make a product or service, you are beggaring thy neighbor. And I would say, taking in some, the United States is trying to do that. And I've talked about this at USTR, at State, and at Commerce. And I would say it was interesting to see the reaction to this. The USTR people kind of thought about it and said, that could be true, but it's not deliberate. Bullshit. It is totally deliberate. If you look at everything the United States is trying to do, it is essentially trying to make it harder for those countries to get access to those elements of the supply chain. Let me give another example, if I may. The National AI Research Resource. Okay, so it was, Fei Li, who was in town yesterday, she and others at Stanford said, we can't create AI at the level that, the academy used to do so. Even if Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, Carnegie Mellon, Michigan all got together, we still couldn't afford it. So the Department of Energy is providing a high-speed compute platform to anybody. Well, right now it's a pilot, which I think Congress will kill, although it is in the law, right, Paul?
Yep.
But I fear they will defund it. And the idea is to make it easier for computer scientists, anybody who wants to use such a platform, to get access to data and the high speed. So for example, on our team, I don't live in the world of computer science, but there isn't a day that doesn't go by that my computer science colleagues don't say to me, I am really struggling to get access to compute. So I have to beg Amazon, as example, to give me compute. So that means I have to come up with projects that Amazon finds attractive. And I'm like, don't I know that? Because I'm always begging for, funding from Ford Foundation or Omidyar or, Microsoft or whomever, right? That seems out of whack to me. If this is something we should care about, we should care about it. That, the language that they use is NAIR, is to democratize access to compute. Here's another thing. When it was planned, there was an advisory board of computer scientists, et cetera, and the idea was it should be available to anybody in the United States at a community college or university or college level. So if you're a Greek student or you're from India or you're from China, if you're in the United States, you could use it. But in its first iteration, it would not be available, let's say, to scholars in the UK or anywhere else. Well, wait a second, the US government doesn't decide who computer scientists work with, and more often than not, Chinese scientists are those scientists. But under NSF rules right now, I must report, because I get NSF funding, I must report any interaction I have with an adversary nation, even if I go to a conference and I sit next to that person. And that is so paranoid and out of control. So do I think the United States is starting to beggar thy neighbor? Yes, I do. And I mean it for the UK as much as I mean, clearly it's not the same degree, but I'm worried about it. Sorry, I'm keen to know what you
I want you to respond to that. Also, maybe this is a chance for you to talk about digital solidarity, because it feels to me like maybe there's a beggar, some of my neighbors policy going on.
Well, I think Susan's points are really good, but then I think it's important to kind of take all those restrictions that you're talking about and think about kind of how you would address those restrictions if, for example, you're the Canadian government and you're trying to figure out, how is AI going to help you from a strategic perspective, a research perspective, an economic development perspective, and so forth. And then you kind of start to see kind of why governments kind of around the world are motivated to start to subsidize AI infrastructure. The Canadian government, for example, has a request for proposals out right now. It's basically to the tune of $1.5 billion US that is looking for ideas about, should it essentially retrofit the Narwhal supercomputing infrastructure? Should it build new AI supercomputers, or should it rely on, the hyperscalers, essentially kind of providing cloud credits for Canadian research, for Canadian startups, and so forth. And so, in a world where the U.S., for I think good reasons, has concerns about kind of China and the use of technology for military purposes and has to do something about that, other countries then see kind of those restrictions and, for very understandable reasons, end up kind of taking their own actions. Now, to your point, does this result in some sort of balkanized world? Perhaps, but I'm kind of more interested in kind of doing kind of the strategic empathy analysis and trying to really figure out where these countries are coming from, and and what ultimately is going to happen with with their investment. Again, a close neighbor, an ally, Canada, is really kind of thinking through how do we go about asserting kind of like more control and providing more direction over this technology. And certainly they're concerned about kind of this kind of two-sided competition that's existing right now.
Yeah, and so just went to a conference yesterday online, so I didn't really go, but it was on China's development of AI and what Canada should do about it. And all I can say here is, like, from my understanding, far from an expert on this, you're looking at it and saying, I empathize with what Canada's trying to do, and I totally agree. And what Canadians say to me is, we don't have the funds. And by the way, they're going to likely have a very conservative government that's not going to be willing to invest that much. Compared to the amounts that we're talking about, UAE, Saudi, US, I know that the Germans feel like they just can't spend enough, so the EU is doing a lot of the spending, and the Germans subsidize even more. But is it enough to compete to get the fastest computers? These costs are becoming astronomical. That's thing one. If this is so, if the United States, I'm not saying that the International Space Station and something superconducting super collider, that thing that's in Switzerland, these things are great successes. It's really hard to do this kind of work. But I think the United States could be doing so much to internationalize and help this. I want to say one other thing. I tend not to be a conspiracy theorist, and I hate when I hear these kinds of things. So one argument is the United States, that I hear from people in other countries, is the United States isn't doing these things. So let's just say, my phone is on Do Not Disturb, so I just can't understand what's going on. So please forgive me.
I have a conspiracy theory for that.
And it's not even a child. So anyway, please ignore this and please forgive me. But I lost my train of thought.
Can I actually, the first point you were making?
Oh, I know what I was
Okay,
gonna
and then I want to come back to the first point you were
Okay,
making.
so what they say is that the United States is determined to preserve the dominance of the data giants overall, über alles. And there is some truth to that, right? Who is the main arguer for these things in the United States? Eric Schmidt, Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, there are differences, right? Some are obsessed with AGI and some are not, but the United States is very frightened. On one hand, we know that for equity reasons, for income inequality reasons, for disinformation reasons, et cetera, we really need to start breaking up these companies. And I think, I used to study regulation. It seemed to me one of the central lessons is that regulation can help innovation. Maybe not immediately, but over the longer term. There's a lot of literature in that regard. And, breaking up Google might not be the worst thing for Google. But, we're not moving in that direction for national security reasons. And so that's where, is it going to accrue to big business over time? I don't know. But I do think it is actually in our interest to foster more competition. Maybe the way that the FTC and the Justice Department have gone about it is the wrong way. But as Pablo was saying, we'll have more models. And more models is a better thing. That said, what I'm saying about overcapacity is I see these governments trying to compete with various models of AI. And I'm only talking generally.
Let's come back to overcapacity in a minute. I want
Just really quickly, because you raised digital solidarity. So, I mean, just digital solidarity is basically the idea that governments, in particular open, rule-bound democratic governments, should work together to develop technology together and use those partnerships as a way to improve kind of the technological situation of countries that need to kind of move up in the stack, and as a result, you get more kind of national kind of control and independence from that. But that self-determination kind of comes from the partnership, again, in cooperation with other countries. I think that what Susan is talking about in terms of more cooperation on AI makes a ton of sense. And the article that I just wrote, it kind of recommended to the U.S. government that perhaps there should be the establishment of an AI cooperation forum that would really kind of think through, these efforts by governments to, build models, to build infrastructure, and perhaps that should happen in partnership. And and from my perspective, the most important element of this is to bring up countries that are earlier in their digital journeys. So countries around the global majority or the global south, where I think that there is a tremendous opportunity for Europe and the U.S., for example, to work together to build that infrastructure and to empower those governments and their citizens to really be more participants in AI rather than just simply kind of consumers and users. So I do think that there's a lot to this idea of kind of trying to work together and and accomplishing other things like kind of stronger government to government relationships, kind of better governance broadly, more communication, which we need. So so that's how I think digital solidarity fits into this.
Yeah, thank you. I want to. We're starting to get questions,
Okay.
so I'm going to move to this. But I just want to ask. I want to ask one question about capacity, because you've talked about this a few times about even the rich countries not being able to keep up. And so, even if this is a normatively desirable thing, and even if the outcome, we agree that the outcomes of it could be great in all kinds of ways, let's talk about capacity and differential capacities in different states. And I guess part of the way I would frame this question is, as much as we may want this, do we end up with the scenario that Kai-Fu Lee outlined anyway, which is only two powers can really do it anyway? And so de facto you end up there.
What is it?
It?
Yeah.
AI sovereignty.
Okay.
So I guess what I would say about capacity is maybe two things. First, I hear your point, and I totally respect it. By the way, if you haven't read Susan's work, please do so. It's available online. So I agree with kind of what you're saying. However, the notion of countries building up compute capacity to achieve kind of economic or strategic ends is nothing new, right? Like if you look at the top 500 list, that's a list of various members of the European Union, Japan, Korea, the United States, formerly China. They're not contributing to the list anymore. And so, this idea of building up that compute capacity, and using it for, kind of weather prediction, perhaps, kind of national security purposes and others, that to me is nothing new. And I have a hard time kind of putting that in the frame of overcapacity, because I think that in some ways in the 21st century, that's just table stakes, right? For any country that wants to leverage the digital environment. And so, I'm still wrestling with the idea of overcapacity and whether that is, really is an issue or not. But again, I just don't think it's anything totally new. One other point on this, speaking of things that are not totally new, one of the motivators, kind of going back to an earlier part of the conversation about kind of what's happening here, is that I think it is just simply the case that that a number of countries in Europe and elsewhere are looking at kind of the advent of generative AI. And by the way, I guess we're on the second anniversary of ChatGPT. I guess it was November 30th of 2022, and they are perhaps, to your point about overcapacity, they're trying to fight the previous battle, right? That they don't want the challenges of social media. They want to capture kind of the mobile opportunity. They wish that they had really been cloud players. And so I think that part of this too is kind of trying to kind of get ahead of that. And you're right, that might be overcapacity. There might be overinvestment. We see that in the private sector as well. But they're just making bets about kind of what this world is going to look like.
Okay, so AI is a technology that I don't think is going to succeed over time without trust. And, especially since we're talking about a technology that may replace humans, often does right now, AGI, et cetera. So many governments have decided that they must have it, as I said before, for, because it is a general purpose technology, and secondly, because it is a critical technology, autonomous weapons and stuff like that. So that means that they're investing, they've made a decision to invest significant amounts, and that's a lot of governments. And in my paper, I list some of those governments in the AI nationalism paper, which we didn't talk about, but it's basically a paper about, is this leading to trade distortions, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And I'm going to use Jay Shambaugh, who is Deputy Secretary of Treasury. He came up with, how do we measure overcapacity? And he's talking about in manufacturing. I've never seen a paper on services or on data. But in any case, I use his metric to look at whether or not we have such overcapacity now. I can't say for sure. Some of the metrics look pretty bad and some don't. But the fact is, over time, okay, nations are going to have to continue that investment if their assessment of where AI is going is right. And we're going to end up with not a lot, it's not like steel. I wrote a paper called AI is the New Steel. And the reason I said that is not because it's not about the employment state, but you get vested interests. And once a subsidy exists or protectionism exists, thank you, Mansur Olson, it's very hard to get rid of, because those people all band together to try to preserve it. And in the same way, I am fearful of the implications of AI overcapacity. It is a risk for AI, okay, that people don't talk about as a risk. And that's why I'm writing on it, because my job at NSF, NIST Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society, is to look at issues of AI governance and data governance and see what is going to undermine trust, what can build trust. And I fear that this competition, in a sense, we've come full circle, as Oshkosh is saying, is going to empower those two countries that have the network, the firms with the network effects, with large troves of data that they don't have to reveal to us what is in those troves of data. We have this opaque world, and we are doing nothing to internationalize that. Pablo just made some good suggestions, and I'd love to see those things come to reality. But I fear in a Trump administration, which tends to view technology as a zero-sum game, I'm really frightened and worried. And if AI and AGI is so consequential, should we not be collaborating and worried about trust? So that's where I'm coming from here. And if you don't, as a scholar, if you don't raise these questions, you know?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Speaking of questions.
Yeah, speaking of questions, let's, Candace? Oh, you have a question? I'm going to take one from the list here, if that's okay, because I thought we sort of covered this, but it's a nice way of phrasing it. Somebody asks, I guess, Pablo, you referred to a quote, requirements of sovereignty. And so somebody asks, are the requirements of sovereignty, as Pablo described it, preventing alternative paths and imaginaries of AI from being implemented? And you, I mean, either of you feel free to answer that.
I love the question. I don't totally get it. Is it?
I think it's about artificial restrictions on innovation, maybe it's restrictions on a technology and sort of like technological development.
Right. No, I see. Again, I think that it really, this is going to depend. I mean, there are, the Indian government, for example, has this 10,000 GPUs program where essentially, again, like what it wants to do is subsidize training capacity for the development of Indian startups and other entities, and so ultimately, honestly, Akash, it's going to depend on the country, and it's going to depend on kind of like what that country's government, in partnership with civil society, the private sector, what they want to do with the technology is kind of like general purpose. And so I don't think that the idea of sovereignty, as we've been discussing, is inconsistent with that outcome. But again, I think it's just context specific.
Okay. Next one. Yeah, Candace?
So first of all, got it? You guys can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So first of all, thank you, because I'm really getting educated, which is what I kind of hope for this symposium, just to have like the first hour just kind of getting up to speed on things I really don't understand fully, despite the fact that I'm sort of trying to run things around here. But all of your analysis and comments are kind of making me think a little bit about the way it was in the USSR back in the day, where one of the kind of features of a command economy is to build around ideology, right? Build your technology with kind of these ideological guardrails, whatever they may be. And they, and during, for instance, Mao's time, it was shaped by the Cultural Revolution. I mean, there's all kinds of moments you can think of in command economies. And it made me think a little bit about the genetic flaw that each political economy has, right? So in a command economy, the flaw is for states to control capital, right, and capital flows. In a sort of liberal economy, a la the U.S., the flaw is concentration of capital in a few hands. And let's say in a Russia of today, you kind of have a hybrid of the two, where it's over-concentration in certain hands who are very close to the president, basically. And I just sort of wonder, what are the levers now that you see for civil society in particular to dislodge or present an antidote to that genetic flaw in the way it's sort of informing the shape and trajectory of AI? I know that's a complicated question, but I think, when we talk about sovereignty, you have these political economy models that are really very foundational, and they're in competition with each other constantly and have been for over a century. So I just wonder what you would say about that.
Did you just write a paper on this?
Did I?
Yeah.
I don't know. That was kind of a blur, man. That was like late nights. I don't know what happened there. So I think you guys better answer that.
AI and agency. I mean, that like what you wrote about is kind of precisely, I think, what.
Somewhat, but I think the question was directed at you all. So I'll let you take a stab at it.
Well, I'll go first. I have written quite a bit about political participation in data governance and AI governance. And I just submitted a grant to a proposal comparing political participation. And I just want to tell you that, does it yield trust? So yes, civil society groups do participate. I've looked at the EU, the United States, Canada, Colombia, Chile, but they're not heard. Like they're asked for their opinion. And I just want to give you a recent example from the United States that I find deeply disturbing. Open-closed foundation models. And so NTIA issued the call. They went to CDT, gave a speech, stakeholders invited in, discussions. I looked at who responded to the call, and I found it really shocking. Something like 30%. Were anonymous. I understand that, right? If you work for OpenAI, you don't want to diss a proprietary approach to foundation models. But that's an awfully large number, larger than I had ever seen before. Maybe it's pre-Trump censorship, who knows? But the call was February. And in their report on it, they didn't cite a single individual or NGO or company. And in general, what I found thus far, looking at AI strategies, is that pretty much the same NGOs and companies that are on advisory bodies are commenting. It's a very small pool of people. So how do you get people in? Your question was about civil society influence. And honestly, I don't think we have the right civil society groups. Can I just give you one example and then I'll shut up? Obviously, most data is analyzed collectively. You're grouped based on your political affiliation, your neighborhood, your sex, your religion, et cetera. Okay. And so we're talking about not privacy, God, I hate that word, but the privacy of individuals in groups that they didn't say they were a part of, that kind of thing. So who talks about privacy in the world? Well, Privacy International, CDT, EFF, but they don't, and certainly most of them, Data and Society, Martin Tisney of Luminate, I don't know where he is now, but these people have been talking about collective privacy, but who's advocating for collective privacy? It's just not there. And so I say and part of that is, what does civil society do, right? They're an interest group, and so I don't want to we could talk about this, but I do think there's a mismatch between how the technology changes and the civil society groups that represent the many interests. But the more important thing is democracies are not really listening to people on these things. So there's been all these strategies to try to, forgive me for using this word, democratize it, through collective intelligence, using AI to find consensus, citizen assemblies, that's EU and Canada. Will those work? They're extraordinarily expensive, and I'm not so sure they're representative either. And I don't know what to do, but I will tell you this, AI governance is so undemocratic. I haven't found a single country, there's this metric by the International Association of Political Participation, and they go from inform, consult, collaborate, and to essentially empower, and no government gets beyond, consulting.
Mm-hmm.
It's just...
Yeah, there's a question like that.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation and conversation. It's been very interesting. My name is Bulani Jili, based out at Harvard University. So my question is really about digital solidarity. And I'm wondering, what does the concept mean for uneven computing capabilities, particularly when the demarcational line is between the global north and south. And the global south, I'm specifically accenting the most vulnerable parts of the global south. In part because what is kind of clear to me is that the discourse of AI sovereignty gets its analytical charge and its political currency in part because of the kind of, say, cemented unevenness between the global north and global south, and that those unevenness has a kind of historical echo.
So the unevenness is, I mean, look, as with so many digital issues, that unevenness is just kind of staring at us in the face. And you're right to point it out. As I look at it, kind of in particular, kind of the generative AI revolution, given that there are really kind of so many tools that are open and kind of like available to many players, is an opportunity to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. You see, for example, Brazil just announced its AI strategy, and it plans to spend something like $320 million on retrofitting its Santos Dumas supercomputer. And I think that that's kind of representative of one way that that the global South can kind of bridge that gap by kind of acquiring these technologies and and leveraging them to level the playing field. Another thing that I think that we're starting to see are, and this is more kind of on the corporate side, so kind of perhaps it's not something that you would be looking at, but for example, like AWS and Orange, French telecom company, have been working together on building AI-capable data centers and services in North Africa. With the understanding that there is kind of both an opportunity to acquire kind of corporate and other customers, but also train those kind of people in those regions. And so I actually think that there's a lot of activity happening. It's just a question of kind of highlighting kind of the countries that are kind of going to lead that charge, and understanding that this is going to be multimodal, right? That different countries are going to have different strategies and different approaches. One last thing that I would point out is, so for example, I think it was in October of last year that a number of Latin American countries got together with, I think, what was called the Santiago Declaration on the governance of AI. If you look through, it's a wonderful document. I know that they worked, kind of together with the UN and other stakeholders, but there is almost nothing in there about building. There is nothing in there about investing. And I think that in order for this gap to get bridged, you really need to kind of start acting less, this is kind of like a requirement that we start acting less, again, as customers or receivers, right? And more along the lines of, of producers and contributors. And I happen to think that there is that opportunity at this moment right now, and that there are different strategies for getting there.
We're getting I want to see how many more questions we have in the room. Can we do a raise of hands? People who have questions. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and I have at least one here when we get to. Maybe we'll take 3 questions in one go, and then you guys can choose how to answer. I've seen that done effectively sometimes.
From the moderators.
Yeah. Oh, you've got the mic. Okay. Do you want to go? Yeah.
Hi. I'm Daniel. I'm from the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, and I do appreciate the shout out on NAIR. I do want to quickly correct that NAIR currently, as in pilot, is available for foreign nationals based in U.S. institutions, but that is a topic.
Oh, that's what I said.
But that is not available to certain projects that's trained on secure national labs resources. But my question is, what do you think about international NAIR? Can we? I think Sea Lion is somewhere close to that, but
somewhere in there.
Yes,
yeah.
But what is the biggest challenge you see for international organizations to come together to create a shared AI research resource?
Okay. Well, let's just take a couple more, and then we'll sort of go through there. So international orgs.
Thank you very much. My name is Jerry John from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. So I just want to ask a question with reference to independence as it relates to sovereignty. I mean, if you are looking at sovereign nations, normally you want to look at a situation where nations are able to make independent decisions, they are able to stand on their own and all that. So looking at the context of digital sovereignty, how do we define independence in this particular context?
Yep.
Okay, one more. Who?
My question is related to what Candace actually mentioned early on and related to also Pablo's comment. I'm curious how you think about a different kind of matrix to measure progress in AI. So far, a lot of attention has been paid to how governments can develop capacity to almost impose its will on the population, how many startups we have funded and how much funds have been raised for the AI races, but not so much on what problems are they really solving and what a people-centered AI development would look like, right? So sort of, tying the question to your civil society comment, right? What would a different metric for thinking about AI lead us in a different way of thinking about it and developing it? Thank you.
Okay. Oh, sure, Jeremy. Okay.
You're testing my context window.
I'm 5 parameters.
Jeremy from Princeton, thank you so much to the panelists. Wondering if you can locate AI sovereignty within other emerging tech sovereignties that are happening now around the world. So from the US perspective, in terms of export controls, inbound, outbound investment screening, it's important, but it's not that important as I understand relative to biotech, relative to quantum computing. China is investing more in biotech now than in AI, as far as I understand. And countries have been competing to gain a first mover advantage on general purpose technologies since the beginning of time. Yes. What is it specifically about AI that makes it sort of conducive to this frame of sovereignty that creates an elective affinity between AI and sovereignty? Can you draw out some of those assumptions explicitly? Is it development implications? Is it the economic implications? Is it sort of the cross-border nature of data flow?
So I, just on the second.
Yeah, but the clock here says 3. By the way, the clock here says 3.
I think the second question, it's so funny. I have this conversation all the time. It's like, oh, hold on a second. Countries have been developing their own telecommunications networks forever, and all kinds of other technology. I think that what makes this particularly salient and important is to simply, on the one hand, again, the geopolitical context that we're in. This kind of competition that we've been talking about. And then secondly, I mean, truly kind of like the uncertainty of the outcome of the technology. I think that for better or for worse, whether it's fiction or not fiction, there is the sense that this is a economy changing, society changing, workforce changing, et cetera, changing technology. And that, I think, really drives governments to say, wait, hold on a second, we need to be players in this space.
Susan, did you want to?
Well, let me thank you for those thoughtful questions, and if we don't answer them, maybe during the break we can all get together from time to time and just bat it around. But I'm totally in agreement with Pablo that, unfortunately, while I do think emerging techs, there's many different technologies that have emerged over time, I can't think of a technology that has so much human displacement potential, and that in turn, I mean, we are the product of the norms, the compassion, and if we are replaced, I do fear the loss of certain values. I also fear the loss of trust, right? Because we cede to a government, right? We have indirect democracy, and if we are not earning money, our sense of self could change, et cetera. So I'm really worried about this. Another thing is that many of the technologies that you cited are increasingly done with AI. As an example, I just want to briefly give the example of digital twins, which I think is a huge path-breaking technology that is just, everybody knows what I'm talking about. So virtual representation of a factory, of a product, of a person. And I've seen it used to predict floods and to practice, how do we respond to a flood, to cancer, potential cancer treatments, and to weigh how the body might respond of a 12-year-old versus a 27-year-old. and to a particular cancer located in the brain. The potential of these technologies to do good is so great, but the world is increasingly opaque, which I just can't wrap my head around. It's the exact opposite of what I think the world should be becoming. It should be becoming more transparent and accountable, and instead something else is happening. And this is increasingly true in the sciences. Not sure what to do about it, and I'm generalizing, so forgive me, but I don't know what to do about it. So I'm going to try to control the realms that I can influence and get people thinking about it. But I do think, like when I talk to scientists, not that I live in that world, but AI is essential to their work now. And I use AI all the time. As I'm a political economist, economic historian. I use it all the time to, for example, help me create. You don't need to know how I use it. You get my point.
Okay.
Just before we end, there is the International NAR, National AI Research idea. I think that's a great idea. I think that
Daniel.
There would be tremendous potential in that. I think definitely would be consistent with the idea of kind of digital solidarity, and hopefully somebody's working on that.
The three of us should write
wonderful
an
that you brought that up.
Okay, I think we need to call it a day-ish. What do we call it? A morning. We call it a morning.
We didn't get to talk about the
There's so much
AI Jenga stack. And
I didn't
all
get
the
to talk
stuff that
about like open AI and open models
yeah.
and all the kind of, there's so much stuff that we wanted to talk about, but I think we're trying to run a pretty tight ship here. So thank you for that. That was really fun. I'm gonna keep talking. Good job.
Yeah, thank you, Akash, Pablo, Susan. That was really great. We're now going to take a 15-minute break, a 13-minute break. Grab coffee, a bite, go to the bathroom, and then back in seats at 11 o'clock for the next round of talks.